It's almost impossible to sound truly unique within the vast landscape of music. Various influences alongside the limitations of certain instruments mean that most artists sound somewhat like other pieces of music from the past or present. So what happens if you take a sleepless freakazoid from Cornwall, give him the ability to create homemade instruments by simply soldering pieces of metal together, and then give him access to enough label funding to do shit like this on a regular basis? Well, then you get Aphex Twin, who is considered by many to be the most important artist within electronic music. An artist who was able to create music that was so ahead of its time, it still somehow sounds inventive and experimental 25 years after its creation. This is how Aphex Twin was able to change the landscape of electronic music forever. So just before we start, Richard James, or Aphex Twin, has a tendency to lie to interviewers just to mess with them. So this video may have certain elements of what are essentially urban legends or myths about the man himself. Richard D. James was born on the 18th of August 1971 in Limerick, Ireland, to Welsh parents. The name Richard would be inspired by his stillborn older brother. The child would unfortunately be stillborn when the parents were residing in Canada for the father's work. The mother was unable to accept the death of the child and therefore kept the name and used it for Aphex Twin as a way to cope. James would quickly move from Ireland to Cornwall, which essentially means moving from a barren wasteland where people speak funny to the middle of nowhere where people speak slightly less funny. Richard described his childhood in Cornwall as pleasurable, mentioning how it felt like he was completely cut off from any form of city, free to do whatever he wanted. Before even understanding the concept of music, James would become obsessed with just making sounds. And I don't mean this. I mean just continuously messing around with various instruments within his parents' house. This involved strings, piano, and tape recording equipment. In a 2001 interview, James had stated that he won £50 in a sound production competition at the age of 11. He explained how he essentially retuned TV signals until he found a strange noise and recorded it. This story is unconfirmed, however, as there is quite literally zero proof, and it sounds eerily similar to an article published in Your Computer magazine in 1982. James would continue with his sound-related obsession, buying his first synthesizer at the age of 12, although only with the intention to make abhorrent noise, no music. He quickly realized he hated any synth he purchased and decided just to create them himself. His musical interest wouldn't begin until James was 14. Apparently, he would become inspired to create music after continuously hearing his sister play vinyls throughout the house, describing the sounds of Jesus and the Mary Chain as bloody awful. Despite his interest in the creation of music coming at the age of 14, James had been tinkering with music equipment for years and was described by family members as a prodigy. His brother claims how he saw James producing music as early as 12 years old, with other close friends and family members exclaiming how he was able to build circuits and synthesizers from scratch, which were used in his later DJ sets. If you're to take the name of his first album literally, it's suggested that a handful of the tracks on the album were created by James as young as 14 years old. Cornwall's music scene at the time was pretty sparse, with only a few record shops. Despite this, they had a flourishing nightlife, focusing primarily on acid house. Whilst studying engineering at college, James frequented his local nightclubs and raves, DJing the popular acid house of the time, as well as utilizing his own music in the mixes. According to James, he had been creating what sounded like acid house years before he had even heard it anywhere else, and upon first hearing the genre outside of his own music, attempted to purchase any and every record he could find in that particular style. You see, even at this point in time, the man who would become Aphex Twin had a very distinct aura, with the lecturers at his college often describing how his mystique left other students in awe, as he would wear headphones whilst attending practical lessons. To be honest, that just sounds like every antisocial, music-addicted motherfucker in the modern day, but I digress. One of the benefits of being from the middle of nowhere is how easy it is to host illegal raves and free parties, both of which had become very common in Cornwall in the late 80s. The large amounts of uninterrupted space, coupled with the bubbling acid house scene, created a perfect backdrop for James's adolescence. His first DJ set would take place at a barn, although various other parties and raves would be held in abandoned churches or coves near the seaside, with the entrance fee for these raves just being a little bit of icky sticky green stuff. It would be around this time that James would meet Tom Middleton and Grant Wilson Claridge. James decided to adopt the moniker Aphex Twin, the origin of which remains debated. Some Some speculate the name stems from his early collaborations with Wilson Claridge, hence Twin. Others speculate the twin is collaborator Middleton, although it's more likely the name references his stillborn older brother of the same name. During the late 80s, the creation of electronic music was incredibly inaccessible. Luckily, the progression of technology in the modern day makes the production of music accessible for literally anyone. This progression hasn't slowed down. This brings us directly to the sponsor of this video, Lalal.ai, a next generation vocal remover and music source separation service. Let me explain. Lalal.ai allows you to upload any piece of music and effortlessly extract an instrument from the mix. For example, you find a song with the perfect percussion to legally use for a sample, but you just want the drum track, you don't want the rest of the song. Just utilize Lalal.ai to extract the drums, resulting in a clean, high quality drum track. Lalal.ai goes even further by recreating and enhancing the stems, not just cutting them out. Let's quickly test it out. So this is the background track I used in this video. Let's quickly remove the drums from this. So you just put it into Lalal.ai, you click separate the drums, and this is the outcome. Now let's try and remove the piano from the same sample. I think the results speak for themselves. Click the link in the description to try it out yourself. The affiliate link directly supports the work on this channel. Lalal.ai even have a generous referral program. For every user you refer that creates an account, you receive 5 free minutes. So what's the wait? Try it out today. Let's get back to the video. Throughout his career, Aphex Twin has always been extremely particular with how and what he releases in terms of his music. He has stated in various interviews that his favorite music is his own and reflects what he actually wants to listen to. This often results in Aphex Twin leaving music unreleased to avoid anyone copying and watering down his style. This is a sentiment he kept early on in his career, with James being unwilling to officially release any of his earliest recordings whilst actively DJing within the Cornwall scene. After hearing an Aphex Twin tape, Free Party organizer Mark Darby was hell-bent on getting it released through his label Mighty Force. James would continuously refuse, although Darby was able to convince him. According to the story, James would be tripping on magic paper backstage, and after being bewildered by Darby continuously waving money, a contract, and a pen in his face, eventually agreed to be signed. Despite James's monumental talent and creativity, much of his early success was spurred on by the people around him, as previous collaborator Wilson Claridge encouraged James to create a record label to release his own music, funded by inheritance received by Wilson Claridge. This resulted in the creation of Reflex Records in 1991. His first official release was a collaborative project with Tom Middleton named Analog Bubble Bath in 1991, although the collaborative work between the two would be short-lived as Middleton left to form Global Communication, leaving James on his own for the production of the second Analog Bubble Bath project. This would prove beneficial as the song Didgeridoo on the project received a decent amount of airplay on local dance radio stations, and perhaps more importantly caught the attention of Renat van die Papilere, who ran perhaps the biggest European rave label at the time, RNS Records. James proceeded to visit the man with the surname I will not attempt to pronounce again in Belgium. He walked into his office and dumped a box of dusty cassettes on his desk, some of which dating back to when James was only 14 years old. The two picked out various tracks from the cassettes with the intention of creating 2 albums, the first of which being Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. Throughout the next couple of years, James continued to work on small EPs under various aliases such as Caustic Window, as well as continuing the Analog Bubble Bath series, although nothing was quite as important as Selected Ambient Works. The album would be released in 1992, although was initially incredibly expensive to purchase in the United Kingdom, being priced at £52 if we take into account inflation. Despite its price, the album quickly received huge amounts of underground attention and acclaim, with Aphex Twin utilizing texture to create an electronic album that somehow sounded naturally beautiful. As the name suggests, the music on the album was recorded throughout a 7-year period, from the ages of 14 to 21, with James utilizing various homemade synths, drum machines, and samples to create the most important album in the development of ambient techno. Pretty quickly after the release of the project, James started receiving requests from bands as prominent as The Cure to remix their work. He would comply, although as continuously stated how he puts little to no effort into these remixes, with one iconic story involving his remix of a Lemonhead song. When the deadline came, Aphex Twin had either ignored the track completely, failing to even listen to it, or had just thrown it aside because it sounded so shit. When the courier came to collect the tape, he grabbed a random old track from his collection. He got paid £4,000 for this piece of work. As the 90s chugged along, the commercial viability for ambient and experimental electronic music was beginning to increase, spearheaded by artists such as The Orb. This allowed James to thrive on the Warp record label, which was intended to showcase the future of electronic music, focusing on experimentation and the pushing of boundaries. This led to James releasing more intense projects outside of the ambient sphere under various aliases such as Polygon Window and AFX. The label placement also allowed him to tour with some of the biggest artists within the genre, supporting The Orb and co-headlining with Orbital throughout various UK and US tour dates in 1993. Despite his high level of productivity through various side projects and tours, Aphex Twin was still working on his second album, set to release on Warp Records. This album would eventually become Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, and would return to the ambient sound he had become known for in his first album. According to various interviews, James had gained the ability to lucid dream around this time, and stated this technique was responsible for 80% of music on the project. A lucid dream is essentially a dream where the individual asleep becomes completely aware that they are in a dream, and in turn are able to control certain aspects of the dream. He stated in an interview that he would go to sleep and purposely dream himself into a studio, surrounded by imaginary pieces of equipment. He would then proceed to make music within his dream, and immediately wake up and recreate it whilst awake. This all apparently took him 20 minutes per session. Take this all with a grain of salt. This could very easily consist entirely of bullshit. Richard James can also apparently see sounds, which stems from a condition known as synesthesia. This also contributed to the creation of the album. This album differs from his first in the fact that it rarely features percussion at all, instead focusing on lengthy textured pads layered to create an ambience that is supposed to replicate the feeling of standing in a power station on acid. The album would receive a mixed response, with some describing it as scarily beautiful and other more diehard fans being disappointed by the more ambient direction and lack of percussion. Despite its mixed response, it can be argued that the release of the project time-stamped an extremely early example of online music discussion. In 1993, an electronic mailing list was created named the IDM list, intended for the discussion of British artists within the burgeoning electronic scene. Before the album's release, the project would be anticipated and discussed heavily within the mailing list. This would be one of the earliest examples of an album being anticipated, experienced, and analysed entirely on the internet, which continues to this day with motherfuckers like this and this. Aphex Twin had become notorious in the underground electronic music scene in the UK, resulting in countless clubs and venues inviting him to play. One particularly funny example would be when James was invited to play at Disobey in 1994. According to him, he was unable to play his actual records, so instead played sandpaper. I'm not sure what that actually means, and I couldn't find any footage, so I'd assume he just rubbed sandpaper together in a rhythmic manner. This was apparently so well received that he utilised a similar performance style in a club in New York in 1997, only this time he chucked a bunch of sandpaper into a food mixer, turned it on, blended the sandpaper, and proceeded to throw the mixer at an audience member. Instead of suing Aphex Twin for being assaulted with a food preparation device, the fan instead insisted the blender get signed. Despite little documentation and footage, this set remains legendary, with sandpaper that was allegedly utilised at one of the events fetching just under $250 on eBay. I would continue to list his various releases throughout this time, although I think it's more interesting to delve into his antics throughout the 90s. A prime example being the time he bought a literal tank. Well, not quite. In the 90s, James purchased an armoured scout car from a shady dealer in Cornwall. Whilst living in Cornwall, he would drive the armoured vehicle around the quiet streets, attempting to play rave music whilst operating the piece of machinery, although the music would just be overpowered by the sound of the engine. He would then decide to transport the vehicle all the way from Cornwall to London, where he apparently would routinely fool around with girls within the vehicle, describing it as having sexual energy. He became infatuated with the armoured scout car, routinely sampling the engine sounds to utilise within his music. He would even use it as a regular vehicle at times, although mentioned how he would have to be careful as one wrong step would result in him going straight through a brick wall. 1995 would see the first usage of the iconic Aphex Twin smile, which has become synonymous with him as an artist. The album I Care Because You Do would feature a self-portrait of Richard James smiling like a maniac. The project featured tracks created between 1990 and 1994 under a range of different electronic styles. The album would be received positively upon release, with many seeing it as a return to form for James, utilizing upbeat and faster tempos. 1 year later, Aphex Twin would release the Richard D. James album, which again featured James on the cover donning a horrific smile. This was achieved by James just f***ing around with his face on Photoshop for a few hours. The album differed from anything James had released previously in the way it was created. Instead of schizophrenically creating abomination in electronic synthesizer form, he instead composed the vast majority of the album on a Macintosh computer. He would bash his keyboard in the rhythm he envisioned and moved each individual drum beats to his liking. This resulted in an album with complicated fast-paced drums, experimenting more with jungle, drum and bass, and breakbeats, although the end product sounds a lot more unique than the modern ambient jungle created by PDFophiles with purple hair and anime avatars. Early physical copies of the album were released alongside a plastic sachet containing a real-life piece of Richard James's hair, which in turn means Aphex Twin predates the habits of money-hungry e-girls by about 25 years. James decided to subsequently purchase an abandoned bank in Elephant and Castle, which was situated right opposite the Ministry of Sound. You'd think living right opposite one of the most iconic clubs in the country and attempting to record music would be a fucking terrible idea, although James remained certain that the four thick walls would protect him from the NPC dance music coming from across the road. You may be asking, why would you want to live in a bank? Well, according to James, he wanted the karma of living in a place where money comes in all of the time, which makes less and less sense the more you think about it. He would begin the production of the Come to Daddy EP within the bank. The project was originally intended to be a death metal parody. The EP would be released alongside a music video directed by Chris Cunningham. Both the drum and bass inspired songs on the project and the music video would receive large amounts of attention within the UK. Richard James was pissed off at the success of the song. He explained how the original idea for the EP was just a joke, and the fact that it had become so big didn't feel right in his head. Despite this, he would continue utilizing the same formula, creating another fast-paced song named Window Licker and accompanying it with a similar music video, also created by Cunningham. The songs on the EP were created using a software called Metasynth, which allows you to insert a digital image as a spectrogram. The software will then convert the spectrogram to digital sound and essentially play the picture as audio. A spectrogram is essentially a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies within a song or piece of audio. Various modern softwares actually allow you to see it. For example, this is what actually shows up if you play the end of which is the second song on the EP. Aphex Twin would continue to play live shows as the 90s morphed into the early 2000s, although the venues in which he would play became increasingly strange. He claimed that no venue was too small for an Aphex Twin concert, and provided the venue was in London and that he had enough time, would routinely accept offers to play at very odd places. This often resulted in Aphex Twin just playing at some random person's house, which led to individuals flooding from the street into the house just to see the concert. Despite remaining in London most of the time, he would still travel for certain concerts and business requirements. One of these trips to Scotland resulted in James leaving an MP3 player containing 180 unreleased tracks on a plane. He knew that sooner or later the MP3 player would be found, with all the songs being leaked online. He also realized he had just one album left on his Warp Records deal and decided to do something a little devious. Various tracks from the MP3 player were released on the double album Druckuse in 2001. Druckuse featured some of Aphex Twin's most popular and iconic songs to date, including the commonly utilized Avril 14th and various other songs that have somehow become popular on TikTok. Upon release, the reception was more negative than previous. Critics and fans had become so used to Richard James continuously pushing the envelope with his creation of music that anything that sounded reminiscent of his previous work became immediately disappointing. The most iconic track on the album, Avril 14th, has been utilized for a beat within an SNL sketch, as well as basically being stolen by Kanye West for his song Blame Game. I would say sampled by Kanye West, although the way in which it was used was incredibly unethical. West's team got in touch with James about using the sample. James actually offered to re-record the piano track to fit the BPM of the song, but for some reason, instead of just accepting it, West's team responded saying, "It's not yours, it's ours, and we're not even asking anymore." They then attempted to utilize the sample without paying James or giving any credit. This was somehow resolved behind the scenes with a re-recorded pre-recorded sample being used on the final song, and Aphex Twin being credited. After the release of Druk Use, Aphex Twin would take an extended break from releasing full-length albums for a number of years. Despite this, he continued to work, releasing various EPs under different aliases and actually still creating full-length albums, although leaving every single one unreleased. As of 2010, he claimed that he had completed 6 full-length albums. Throughout this period, various teasers would be released for projects, with label founders hoping to announce a record release as early as 2009. Despite this, any talk regarding full-length albums would remain quiet until 2014, with the only remarkable full-length release coming in the form of Melodies from Mars, which was essentially a collection of unreleased tracks that had been circulating in the underground for various years, with the Aphex Twin community claiming that individuals in black suits would turn up to your house asking you to remove the album from any online website if you were to upload it. This album remains officially unreleased to this day. In 2014, a test pressing of an unreleased Aphex Twin album named Caustic Window appeared on Discogs for $13,500. Members of the internet forum We Are the Music Makers quickly found it and decided to negotiate a deal with the seller as well as Richard James and the label itself. They decided to launch a crowdfunding campaign on Kickstarter to raise money for the purchase of the album. The Kickstarter raised $67,000, with the proceeds being split between Richard James, Reflex, and the charity Doctors Without Borders. James reacted extremely positively to the campaign, seeing it as incredibly touching and sweet. This in turn inspired Richard James to continue to focus his efforts on the creation and release of music. James would quickly begin recording and producing songs that were composed over the space of 7 years within his various studios across the UK. On August 16th, 2014, a green blimp with the Aphex Twin logo and number 2014 would begin flying over London. Adjacent to this, various pieces of Aphex Twin graffiti would appear around London. 2 days later, Aphex Twin would post a link to Twitter which directed the user to a hidden service only accessible by dark web softwares such as Tor. The link would detail the album title and track listing. Despite the album apparently being leaked multiple times onto YouTube, each of the leaks ended up being fake, with Cyro being officially released on September 19th, 2014. The final product would be Aphex Twin's poppiest to date, although it still has plenty of unique electronic and ambient elements. This album was said by James to be the end of an era, and an excuse for him to start creating music that sounds entirely different to anything he's made in the past. Despite this, no full-length Aphex Twin project has been released since 2014, although James has still released various interesting EPs, including computer-controlled acoustic instruments created using robotic instruments such as the self-playing piano known as the Disclavier. Aphex Twin has remained mysterious and silent in regards to the release of a new full-length. This has only strengthened speculation from the fanbase, as every couple of years the community will dig up some sort of clue alluding to a new project. One example would be in 2023, when fans found a website featuring only the Aphex Twin logo and word London. This immediately signified a new project for fans, although ended up just being James teasing the fact that he was going to headline Field Day Festival that year. In 2024, Aphex Twin announced the release of an expanded edition of Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, set to release in October. The project would include 8 previously unreleased songs. Aphex Twin is perhaps the most important artist if we were to look towards the development of electronic music. His music was so forward-thinking that many of the songs released over 25 years ago still hold up as innovative, interesting music that is difficult to replicate even with the advancements of modern technology. To be fair, I might be glazing a little bit too much. Attempting to shuffle play the Aphex Twin discography whilst literally doing anything is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable and schizophrenia-inducing audio-based experiences you can have.